There was a vicar, apparently, who was in the habit of writing the theme for his Sunday morning service sermon on his family calendar. And on this particular occasion, he was preaching about sex. And so he thought, well, I don't really want to write sex on the calendar. It looks a bit odd to people. So he decided, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write the word sailing. That'll do. That will be a prompt for me this week, sailing. So early in the week, he attends the church staff meeting, and one of the church wardens comes up to him, they're just chatting, and they said, oh, what are you preaching on this week, Vicar? And he says, oh, I've been preaching about sex. And the church warden says, oh, okay, that's very interesting. You're looking forward to that one for sure. And a little bit later in the week, the church warden has to pop round to the vicarage and speak to the vicar about something. The vicar's wife opens the door, and the church warden says, is your husband home? He says, oh no, he's out, I'm afraid. And then as they're making small talk on the doorstep, the church warden says to the vicar's wife, he says, well, I am looking forward to your husband's sermon this coming Sunday. It should be really interesting. At which point the vicar's wife looks at the family calendar and says, yes, it should be interesting. I'm not quite sure why he's preaching on that subject. As far as I know, he's only done it twice. The first time he fell in, and the second time his hat blew off. So there we go. I don't know if it's a true story or not, but there we go. Right. We live in a society. Almost every society has been obsessed with sex, and over the years, and we live in a society, don't we, that is becoming increasingly sexualized. Things that were almost inconceivable 30 years ago are now just commonplace. You don't have to wander the streets of Soho anymore to find pornography. It's just literally a few clicks away on your laptop or on your phone. Erotic novels have become the mainstream, and there are apps that will helpfully organise for you one-night stands or even affairs if you so desire. Apparently, Channel 4 ran a TV show last year in which previously monogamous couples were encouraged and invited to welcome other people into their sexual relationships. We live in a world that is becoming increasingly sexualized. Our sexual ethic in this country seems now primarily to be based upon two quick checks. Firstly, is it legal? Secondly, is it consensual? And if the answer to both of those things is yes, well then it's all good. But is it? But is it all good? We also live in a society, don't we, where almost every month, maybe even every week, there's another heartbreaking story of sexual abuse, whether that's behind the doors of the RFU or within the police, whether it's vulnerable women trafficked across international borders, whether it's hidden somewhere amongst the glitz and the glamour of Hollywood, whether it's through social media empires or even whether it's within the Church of England. It feels like there's nowhere and there's no one who is entirely immune. And then in the middle of all that, there's Jesus and his sermon and his sexual ethic. It's a sermon that I've said before a few weeks ago now, but he speaks just to an ordinary group of people, ordinary bunch of people gathered around from the shores of Lake Galilee. And I think as he speaks to them, he has a vision for something. He has a vision for a new community of faith that would gather around him. He would be their focus. They would be transformed by the inner working of the Holy Spirit. They would live out an ethic of love for God, love for their neighbour. And as they do that, they would be so unique within the world that they would be like salt to decaying meat and like light to the darkness. As they live out that ethic of love for God and love for their neighbour, they would flavour society with the seasoning of heaven, and they'd point people all of the time back to Jesus. So what does Jesus have to say? What is Jesus' sexual ethic? What does he say in this passage? I think the first thing and to say, and this is something that we can easily forget, we all know it, but it's easy to forget it, is of course that God created sex. And at the end of the creation stories in Genesis, when God looks at what he's created, he looks back and he says, what I've created is very good. When God thinks about sex, he thinks of something that is very good. It's not just good, it's uniquely powerful. It has the power to take two individuals, Genesis says, and fuse them together as one spiritual being. And because of its beauty and because of its power, God chooses to set it within certain boundaries. God isn't embarrassed about sex. God isn't surprised about sex. Have you ever watched Wildlife on One? You know that things get quite creative out there, and God isn't surprised or taken aback by any of that. He sees it as beautiful and he sees it as uniquely powerful. So what does Jesus say here on the subject? Well, in much the same way that he deals with the issue of murder and the issue of anger, Jesus begins by really pointing out to people that so often the issue is not just with our actions, but actually the issue is with our hearts. It's with the inclination of the human heart. No wonder King Solomon at the beginning of the book of Proverbs says, above all else, guard your heart. This is what Jesus says. He says, you have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. You can adjust the gender pronouns in that as you see fit. Jesus begins by referencing the seventh commandment, you shall not commit adultery. It's a commandment that few people gathered around him, probably few people today would have the audacity to disagree with publicly. Adultery was easy to define. There was a clear line that needed to be crossed in order for that commandment to be broken. And I imagine that most of the people listening to Jesus on that day considered themselves innocent of such a trespass. But as Jesus continues, it's like he seems to be merging the seventh commandment with the 10th commandment. The 10th commandment said, you shall not covet. It's as if Jesus is encouraging people to read all of the commandments together and to consider them in the light of each other. A very sensible idea. Coveting was far less easy to define. It concerned the desires and the lusts of the human heart. The line that had to be crossed wasn't clear. And few of those people listening to Jesus, and few of us probably sitting here today, could honestly say that at no point in our lives had we coveted our neighbour's wife or husband or lawn or house or camel or Ferrari or holiday or wardrobe or whatever it might be. In other words, Jesus maybe is saying adultery doesn't just take place in the bedroom. It takes place in our hearts in the same way that he talked about murder. Now, when Jesus talks about lust, he's not speaking simply about physical attraction. It's natural for us to be physically and sexually attracted to other people. That is how we've been created. That's how we've been wired and designed. Whether it's their physical appearance or their persona, each of us, of course, finds other people attractive, and that is natural. But there is a difference, isn't there, between finding somebody attractive for whatever reason and looking upon them in order to arouse that kind of desire. There's a difference between just noticing a person's beauty and actually desiring to possess them in some way or other. In Nicky Gumbel's book, The Jesus Lifestyle, it used to be called Challenging Lifestyle or something like that, he poses the question, what's the difference between appreciating somebody's beauty and lust? And he gives the answer, I imagine, sort of slightly humorously, usually about 2 to 3 seconds. All of us understand, don't we, that difference. We all understand the difference between finding somebody attractive and that transition in our hearts and our minds to actually desiring them in a way that isn't right or isn't appropriate. Lust is always the antithesis of love. Love values a person, but lust devalues them. Love builds someone up, but lust degrades them. Love always seeks to serve the other, but lust is always self-seeking and seeks only to serve itself. Solomon says, above all else, guard your heart. Jesus later in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 15, I think, says that all kinds of evil proceeds from the heart. And Jesus' vision for us, Jesus' vision for those people gathered around him as he preached that Sermon on the Mount, was for people whose hearts are changed. And rather than being a people who are filled with covetousness and lust, are actually a people who are filled with contentment and with love. So how do we do that? How do we, in a society that is increasingly sexualized, guard our hearts? Well, Jesus comes up with some unorthodox advice. Verse 29, this is what he says. He says, if your eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Now, some people over the course of Christian history have taken Jesus extremely literally. Origen, who was one of the great early church fathers, went so far that he actually castrated himself. Such was his frustration with his lustful inclination. I want to just assure you that Jesus, I don't think, was in any way advocating any form of self-mutilation. After all, as he's saying, the issue is in the heart. You could cut off any number of appendages and still find that your heart is full of covetousness and lust. But what is evident from what Jesus is saying is that Jesus wants us to take this seriously. The Bible is full of wisdom in this area when we're faced not just with sexual temptation, but temptation of all kinds. There's the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Do you remember that from the book of Genesis, where Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him and Joseph literally just runs out of the house? Job says, I have made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully at a woman. The psalmist writes, I've hidden your word in my heart that I might not sin against you. It's interesting to reflect on that verse and then Jesus' experience in the wilderness when he's tempted by Satan. King Solomon, thought of as the wisest person that ever lived apart from Jesus, writes a whole chapter in the book of Proverbs on the subject, chapter 5, if you're interested. All of these are useful, but I want to turn for a few moments to 1 Corinthians 10 and 2 Corinthians 10 and just consider a few things that Paul says in these passages. So this is what Paul writes. He says, no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. And in 2 Corinthians 10, he says this, the weapons that we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Let me just mention 4 things from what Paul says. The first is that Paul says all temptations are common to humankind. None of us are alone. All of us face the same kinds of temptation. Some of us struggle with some things more than others. But all of us understand what these temptations are like. They come to us all. In the book of Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews says that Jesus was tempted in every way and yet was without sin. Because of that, Jesus is able to empathize with each one of us in our experiences and what we go through. But these temptations are common to all of us. And actually because of that, and David talked about this last week when he talked about anger, but actually there is sometimes value in sharing our struggles with other people. Not in an inappropriate way, but sometimes there's value in just getting alongside one or two people that we know love us and trust us and just being honest about some of the struggles that we face. I used to meet with a couple of other guys when I was at college, and we used to talk about all kinds of things, and we'd pray together and just chat about all sorts of stuff going on in our lives. But one of the questions we'd often ask each other was how's your heart and how are your eyes? And it was a good question to be asked. It was a good question to be asked in the presence of two people that I knew loved me and two people that I trusted. And we'd ask each other, not for the benefit of sort of one-upmanship, but because we know that the temptations we face are common to all of us. And there's value sometimes in sharing and being honest. The second thing that Paul says is that God is faithful. God is on our side. He's on my side. He's on your side. God is a loving, gracious Father. He's always for us. He's never against us. And he longs for us to come into a greater experience of freedom and purity in every area of our lives, because he knows that is what is best for us. The Bible says that his mercy is new every single morning. It says that he's made us holy. He sees us as holy through the cleansing power of Jesus' blood shed on the cross. How amazing it was to sing about that over and over again already this morning. It says that his Spirit lives continually within us, transforming us from the inside out into the likeness of Jesus. God is faithful to us. The third thing Paul says is that none of us attempt beyond what we can bear. And in every moment of temptation, Paul says, God promises a way out. Father, help us to see and take the way out. And the final thing that Paul mentions here, or that I'll draw attention to, is that the spiritual weapon that he speaks about here, or one of them, is this idea of taking our thoughts captive. When our thoughts begin to stray, when they begin to become contrary to the truth and the will of God for us, we actually can take those thoughts captive. We can refuse to continue to dwell upon them, and instead we can dwell upon something different. When that natural kind of attraction strays into covetousness and lust, we can take those thoughts captive and make them obedient to Jesus. Jesus longs for us to experience freedom and purity in every area of our lives, including in terms of our sexual being. One of the Beatitudes is, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Next, Jesus turns to the subject of divorce. And I don't know what the time is, but I do now. I'm mindful that this is a hugely sensitive subject, and actually what Jesus says about it is complicated, and I'm aware that for people this carries a lot of pain from the past. I understand that. Let me just say a little bit about what Jesus says. I think to begin with, when we look at what Jesus says about the subject of divorce, it's really important to understand the culture and the context that he speaks into. Within the Greek and the Roman world, divorce was commonplace. Amongst the Gentiles, it was just commonly practiced. And it was easy for husbands, not for wives, but for husbands. First century poets speak of women who were divorced in excess of 10 times by 10 different people. All a husband needed to do was to give spoken notice to his wife that she was now divorced, and that was it. She was now on her own. Within the Jewish world, things were a little bit different. The subject of divorce was a really hot topic for Jews. Historically, the Jews had had a really, really high view of marriage. It was one of the things that separated them from the other cultures around them. They were, generally speaking, against divorce unless the man found evidence of indecency. And way before Jesus lived, there'd been great debate amongst the Jewish people as to what indecency meant. There were two schools of thought that had formed. There was a more conservative view that believed indecency only really ever related to adultery. And there was a much more liberal view that believed that almost anything could fall under the subject or the condition of indecency. If you asked your wife for coffee in the morning and she brought you tea, then it was literally potentially grounds to divorce her. All you had to do was give her a written notice. Well, of those two views, in a world that was dominated by men, you can imagine which of the views had become the popular view amongst the Jewish people. It was the liberal view. It was the view where husbands could literally just divorce their wives for almost anything, providing they provided her with a piece of paper. It wasn't that different to the Gentile world around them. Of course, Jesus meets the woman by the well in Samaria. You know the story from John 4, and she's had 5 different husbands. And so actually, as Jesus speaks on this subject, that's the kind of context that Jesus is speaking into. And he challenges to the very core that type of practice. In chapter 19, later on, there's a much longer passage where Jesus speaks on this subject. He's actually asked a question about divorce. But what he does is he turns it and begins by speaking about marriage. And he talks and quotes from Genesis chapter 2. And this was the traditional view of marriage that the Jews had. In that passage it says this: a man shall leave his father and his mother and be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That was the view of marriage that the Jews had, and that was the view of marriage that Jesus, whenever he's asked about marriage, reiterates. It involves 3 key elements. It used to be called leaving, cleaving, and becoming one flesh. In marriage, a husband and wife leave their parents and their previous families and form their own. They cleave to one another in that moment. In other words, they begin to share life together in every kind of way. And in that context, it says that they become one flesh. That through their sexual union, they become like one. Jesus' understanding of marriage was that it was to be lifelong. That when you married somebody, you were making a choice to love that person and to be faithful to them, come what may. In the wedding service, the marriage service that we have within the Church of England, it says that when you marry the other person, it says, I'm choosing you for richer, for poorer, for better, for worse, in sickness and in health, until death us do part. Now, there are moments, of course, when it doesn't work out like that. Moses and Jesus both had made allowances for those occasions. Sometimes marriages do end. Sometimes it's best for both parties, or maybe for one party, for the marriage to come to an end. And when that happens, those moments are intensely painful for people. They're painful for the couple, they're painful for their families, they're painful for the community. And when that happens, we walk with people in grace and love, and we seek to care for them and look after them. We recognize that it doesn't always work out. And Jesus understood that. And so did Moses. And there was allowances made for those moments. And of course, I'm aware that that might be something that has affected you in your life. And God's grace and love is all over you in the struggle and the pain of that. But I guess fundamentally, in a society that had cheapened marriage, for men who had power who could just get rid of their wife just like that, Jesus challenges them to the absolute core. And he reminds them of what the commitment of marriage was really all about. And he urges them to honour it as he and his Father honoured it. You know, we live, don't we, in a world, I said this at the start, where very often our sexual ethic is little more than, is it legal and is it consensual? But actually Jesus' vision for us is so much more than that. Jesus' vision of sex and marriage is such a beautiful thing, such a uniquely powerful thing. And God's longing for us as individuals is that we might know his grace and freedom and purity in every area of our lives. And that we as a community and as individuals, in a world that is increasingly sexualized, in a way that may not be particularly helpful to it, that we would be like salt to decaying meat and light to darkness, that we would show a different way, God's way, God's sexual ethic. And what a beautiful privilege that is to walk in that as his people. Let's pray.